It was all about trying to fit in, knowing that belonging was not what I was going to get.
The stories we carry don't end when they happen. They echo. They shape how we see the world and who we become. I'm Femi Akonde, and this is Echoes and Parables, where we make sense of the stories we live.
When I think about my years in Nigeria, I think about the relationships that I had there and how at some point after moving to the US, there was a change that happened that made me feel or fear that it would be really hard to connect with those relationships like I wanted to or I believed I could. Because I feel like my time in Nigeria, and now that I'm looking back, it was more about trying to belong. I would say that was a running thread throughout my time, especially starting from secondary school. It was all about trying to fit in, knowing that belonging was not what I was going to get in the way that I thought I needed. I think I realized early in life that if you do the good things, or if you do the things that are deemed acceptable and noble, and you didn't do the bad things, then you would be accepted. You'd get all the praises. So I felt that's the route I would always take because it was the safest. Safe is a good word. It was the way I learned to protect myself. I was darn well going to be good at academics. I was going to do all the good things where if I had to be in youth fellowship, be a good Christian, don't drink, that was never going to be a problem for me because I was going to do the good things that would make me acceptable. I feel like children at a young age is just who you are. But I think at that, between 8, 10, into your teenage years, it starts dawning on you that something isn't quite right here and you don't know what it is. There's no language to put to it or to describe it. And I want to say it's even more of a feeling that's just inside. You just start learning that I need to protect myself. There's something not right or not normal. I don't like using the term normal, but let's just say for sake of understanding within that culture, I would say it was not normal. And I was like, there is a path that is common, so I'm just going to try and fit into that path.
You're one of those people who I feel caught on very quickly to what you wanted to do with yourself in terms of work and your interests.
Even though I'd like to take full credit for me choosing or knowing what I wanted to do, I don't think that would be completely true. I like to think that, yes, I had a passion for baking, but now that I've grown up, I think that in as much as I chose it, it also chose me. And that actually makes more sense to me because if you think about the culture that we grew up in, I totally saw baking as a hobby. It wasn't something that seemed practical for a career. And so it was just something I did because I liked it. And then eventually I could make some money off it. And it provided a space that I personally needed, even though I didn't think or know that I needed it at the time. Coming back to the whole baking thing, that's why I say it chose me because it was just something I could not stop doing because I also needed it so much.
And you needed it because it gave you freedom?
Yes, exactly. Because, and I can only put language to this now that I can look back and see what was going on, was that it gave me a space where I could just be me. It was a space for me, and that also translated to being not only a safe space in the sense that I could fail, I could mess up, but I could still come back and do this without any judgments. It was a space where I belonged because I was producing something that made me happy, that other people liked. It gave me everything about an identity in the sense that there's a story to it. And also there's the idea of growth and becoming. So I could see myself getting better and better.
Who we become is often shaped by things we didn't fully understand at the time. Your family, one of the first things I remember with you guys is flowers.
Yes. So my mom is a medical doctor, but she had this strong love, passion, affinity for horticulture and flowers. I guess it started out as a hobby for her, just growing roses and delving into that floristry part. But it eventually became a business for her. And if you think about my mom, Dr. Okon, you're going to think about flowers, especially if you live in Jos. I remember growing up always having a very large garden of all sorts of flowers.
When did you leave, and what was the situation around you leaving?
I left shortly after I completed my NYSC. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next, and I started looking into culinary schools, and I got accepted into CIA, which is the Culinary Institute of America in New York. And yeah, that was how I moved. It was exciting because I was going to go to this culinary mecca. You're just around people that have the same passion as you are, and you have all that knowledge, the techniques, the ingredients, everything just right there in front of you. I'm glad it happened because it got me understanding what the culinary scene was here in the US and how different it was from where I was coming from.
Were you part of culinary competition TV program at any time?
Yeah, over the past years, I've done 3 of those TV shows on the Food Network. So the first one that would have been Food Network Challenge, and then I would have done Cake Wars, and then it was Best Baker in America. So all those are all on the Food Network.
This is still what you're doing now, isn't it?
Yes, I call it pastry chef, call it a baker. This is what I do full time right now. I've been so grateful for the opportunity to be able to carry something like that through.
You have this art that is giving you expression and giving you a space to exploit your creativity. Is there a dependence on that?
I don't know if dependency would be a good word. I don't want to say that there was a time where my identity completely depended on baking. That's not how I felt. It was more of the safety it gave me, the safety and, funny enough, independence it gave me. The independence from me pushing myself into fitting into a certain path was there. And also, it gave me financial independence. That's always a good feeling, you know. And it also helped that I really liked what I was doing. It helped that, just for lack of a better term, it gave me that opportunity to engage with creativity, to start understanding that there's something bigger than myself, and that's whatever creative force you want to see in the world. And that's been very important for me because I work on projects where I do a cake, and I cannot believe that came out of me. Yes, it's a lot of work, there's a lot of pressure, but sometimes it's like something just went through you that you didn't know you were capable of.
That path where you are creating stuff, does that move in parallel with the part where you are dealing with people, the social side of you versus the creative side?
I would say that they kind of intersected in the sense that the fact that I was baking also opened up relationships for me. Again, people thought what I was doing was good, and in a small way, by patronizing what I was doing, gave me a sense of friendship. It gave me a sense of knowing that I had something to offer in the relationship. Yes, it was part of myself, or a gesture of kindness in the form of a cake, but it gave me the idea that I had something to give. The older me right now, and after therapy, it's like in relationships, you're more about giving yourself. That's what you should be giving. And I was substituting giving myself for something I was producing. And again, it's the mechanism for protection, for safety.
How has your search for safety evolved? What's that journey been like?
I will say it's still ongoing. I don't think it's something that's ever going to be completely done. I don't think you can talk about safety without talking about shame.
Every story carries something. Sometimes it just takes time to see what that is.
If you're in an environment that is void of shame, you automatically feel safe there. So shame would be the one thing that when I come into a space, I'm asking myself, are there feelings of shame here? Are there feelings of judgment? And if that's there, it triggers the idea that this is not a safe space for me. Again, I could be wrong, but that's the trigger that happens.
Was there any space in Nigeria where you could articulate yourself before you left?
No, not at all. I mean, if you think about the culture, there wasn't even a language. There wasn't even language to describe. I didn't even know how to articulate it myself. I can only articulate this now after, like they say, some things are better seen from the outside. I can only articulate that and then obviously experience age and all the other things. But in Nigeria, there was nothing to articulate that. We don't even talk about those things. I think to a certain extent in Nigeria, shame is seen as a good thing, which is weird because, or maybe in most African cultures, shame is seen as something to prevent you from doing bad. So it's seen almost in a positive light. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think there's a difference between shame and guilt, obviously. Yeah, you can feel guilty about doing something. It's something you did. Shame is speaking more to the person of who you are as opposed to something you did. So in my case, it was all internalized shame. And that was what was driving the idea that there was something abnormal that had to be hidden, even though I didn't know how to describe what I was hiding. Shame is just such a devious thing that I think has to be rooted out, and it takes a long time.
How do you put that side by side? You growing up in a Christian family, how did you process that?
When I think about religion in Nigeria, and particularly Christianity, I don't think we were ever taught that Christianity was supposed to bring out shame. They didn't even use the word shame. I feel like Christianity, or my experience of Christianity, was that it was so good at making you feel ashamed as opposed to taking, because it has all these rules. And you're like, if I don't meet these rules, then it's a reason for me to be ashamed. So rather than removed shame, more like entrenched it. And it didn't even talk about it. I'm trying to remember an experience where it was talking about shame. No, I don't remember. I can't remember that.
So then you moved to the US. How did that change anything?
So you would think that the US is completely different from Nigeria, and it doesn't happen like that because American culture also has its, it can be one, very religious, depending on what part you jump into. And again, those undertones of shame related to religion still persist, irrespective of where you are. I would say the difference about America was that I felt like it was bigger. So there were things to explore if you had the courage to. There were other ideas to interact with, to engage with, and that were not there in Nigeria. And remember, my time in Nigeria was before the internet. Best we had was like email, something like that. There was no YouTube or anything where you could get information that give you differing ideas or differing perspectives on certain things, or even just give you language.
I was telling you about your book reading. Has that just been alongside your solitude space?
No, I've always liked reading. I remember in secondary school when we're reading, oh gosh, what were those books? Frederick Forsyth. I remember there are times when we would rip the books into different parts because people wanted to read different parts at different times. So I'd been reading for quite a while. I was reading all that and stuff. So when I moved to the US as well, that continued. So earlier, then I got into audiobooks. A friend of mine, we always laugh about this. Before we had MP3s or before you could listen to a book on your phone or iPod, they were on CDs. And they would come like 5 CDs or 6 CDs for a book. And she gave me this, we were talking about books, and she was like, yeah, she just listened to this book. And I remember condescendingly, I said to her, oh, you listened to this book and you think you read it? So, such a horrible thing for me to say when I think about it. And she was like, you need to listen to this. But it was so good. It was so engaging that I would sit in my car and I wouldn't get out of the car, like even when I'm parked, just still listening to it. So that's how I got into listening to things. Remember when TED Talks were a big thing, when podcasts started becoming a thing. Before I knew it, I was like, how did we live without things to listen to? So coming to the US there was all that, but what the challenge for me would have been, did I have the courage to break from what I knew and to fully consider or engage with these other perspectives or ideas? And that is where it gets really hard, because you've lived a certain way for 25 years. You just don't turn that off, especially when it's tied deeply to shame. I think you have to unravel what the cause of that shame is, and that can be a very scary process.
And did you unravel it? How have you unraveled it?
Again, it's still a work in process. It took me over a decade or more to finally have had enough personal struggle and personal challenges and learning as well to be able to fully engage with these other perspectives, or to give me the courage to challenge what I was raised in. It took a long time. It took a long emotional time to work through that. And I'm still working through it. Some days are good. Some days you're like, oh, I'm making tons of progress. Some days I'm like, oh my gosh, it feels like I haven't done anything. But I've learned that the most important thing is to show up, to engage, and to be present. There's not much I can do about the past. I can learn from it. I have little control over what the future is. Sometimes that's the hardest thing, to get up and be like, okay, I'm going to show up today. I feel like that's what life is about.
Do you still see yourself in the context of the culture you are coming from? Or is that a more independent thing at the moment?
Identity is a really complex thing. There's no 48-year-old me without the 5-year-old me. I will always be Nigerian. I will always have that identity, right? That as somebody who grew up in Nigeria, whatever cultural identity markers you want to, I will always have those, right?
Yeah.
However, the paradox is, how do you identify with a community or a culture or even a nation that sort of rejects you, that questions your belonging or gives you conditional acceptance? So it's like, how do I reconcile that? I can't say I have the answer to that, because deep inside, I know I'm Nigerian. There are things about being Nigerian that I'm proud of that make me who I am. And there are things about being a Christian that I'm proud of. And there's a lot of good that has come from that. But there's also a bit of bad that's come from that as well. And it's an ongoing struggle to source meaning or an identity out of that struggle.
Do you feel like you have a place where you speak for people other than yourself that may have the same struggles and internal conflict with where they're from versus who they are?
Oh, in the past, maybe there were some avenues that I had explored about doing that particular thing. Sadly, I don't think I kept up with it because I just felt it was useless. It was a useless endeavor. I just felt I wasn't making any difference. And in addition, there were also things about myself that I needed to work on that made me think that probably I wasn't necessarily at the right position or the right place to be speaking for somebody else or advocating for somebody else. And again, that's me also unraveling another layer of shame that's basically saying you're not there or you're not good enough to do this. I think that maybe that's the next stage of my life where it's not about inspiring people. Maybe it's not even about advocacy. It's just about telling your own experience and letting people do whatever they would do with that information, letting them take what they would take from that story. And I can't control how they would use the information. It could inspire them. It could challenge them. Some people might just decide not to even pay attention to it. They're like, it might be indifference. But if I place the burden of me trying to educate people or trying to inspire people, it would be detrimental to myself because I would feel like I'm failing. The best I can do is authentically tell my story, my experience, be present, and let people do with that information what they will do. It gives me a freedom in the sense that it's almost like I really don't care what you think. This is just who I am.
To what extent have you explored your own freedom? How far have you gone in speaking out for yourself in order to push aside the shame or the conflict?
So when I look back, I've come a long way. I will also say the world has come a long way. The US has come a long way. And so I've seen the changes, which has made it a little easier because I imagine that it's terribly hard for people in other parts of the world where that freedom isn't afforded. Even for me, who's in a country that we believe has some of the best freedoms available, it's still a challenge because they are also dealing with it themselves. The first thing, of course, is acceptance. That happened formally probably over a decade ago, but what acceptance does is that it gives you, it opens the door to dealing with shame. It opens you up to the tools available for you to deal with shame. And that's where the work starts. Acceptance is just the very first and necessary step. Sometimes I would think, oh my God, I've gone so far. I can talk about this. I can be more open. I've got to a point where I don't care about what people think about me in certain respects. But then I also find myself some days where I'm like really bothered by what people think, or I'm filled with regret about things that I may have done to myself or time lost. Funny enough, I went for my physical checkup early last year, and the doctor calls me in and he's like, your blood sugar levels are really high. And I remember I came out of the office, the doctor's visit, and I was so bothered. And the first thing that came to my mind was, this is just another tick that says I'm not good enough. And it made me stop the moment I said it to myself. And I was like, so what's the first one? And it brought me back to the idea that I was still ashamed of who I am. It was just that this was a realization that I hadn't completely dealt with that. It was like a light bulb moment that, yeah, there's still things here that you have to address. What do I replace that shame with? What does that practically look like for me? I mean, it's a lot.
If you can just stay with that for 1 second, what does that mean for you to substitute the shame?
So my approach to that would be, I want to know what the opposite of shame is. That's what I want to replace shame with, right? And it's also important for me to know what the counterfeit of that thing is. So the thing that I'm looking for. So, okay, I want to know what the opposite is, or opposite of shame is. And I also want to know, the opposite of shame would be true belonging, would be true acceptance, would be authentic living, right? But I also want to know what the counterfeit of true belonging is, what I could easily mistake true belonging for. And that would be fitting in. And I'm going to be very careful when I speak about this. The other thing would be isolation, because isolation is closely tied to shame. But there's a difference between isolation and solitude, because in my life, I found that solitude can be very kind. It's a way of showing kindness to myself. It's a time for reflection. I believe solitude is one of the spiritual disciplines because it's a good virtue and it is kind. But there is that is kinder than solitude, and that's authentic community. So for me to beat out shame, I need to find belonging in true, authentic communities where I can be fully seen without any fear or judgment.
Fear or judgment. You mentioned that there were a few things you talked about that had to do with regret. When you look back and say regret, what are you referring to? We don't always realize it in the moment, but certain experiences stay with us longer than we expect.
I think the thing that I regret the most was the time lost. So I spent close to a decade or even over a decade trying to fix something, trying to fix myself. I went through conversion or reparative therapy for 10 years. And this is something that I chose. You can say it was forced on me by culture or by tradition or by fear, but I made that choice to engage with that and to engage with it for such a long time. And if I think about the age, that was my 20s through almost my late 30s, that is a good chunk of time. That is time where you're learning who you are. You're learning how to engage. It's a very formative age for your future. And that's time that I'm never going to get back. That's time that I can say I practically used to harm myself. And so, yeah, that would be one of the biggest regrets.
So shame is usually a function of other people's expectation of you and your inability to meet that expectation. You agree that is the way you've thought about this?
Yeah, I would completely agree with you there. And that's where I feel I've also learned that expectation is also, like you said, it's very tied. It's closely tied to shame, because when you know you can't meet an expectation, it drives you to shame. Mm-hmm. Years ago, I remember reading this book. It was very popular, The Shack. I don't know if you remember that, but there was a time when The Shack was so popular. And I remember the author making this comparison between expectation versus expectancy. So expectation it's a noun, it's static. You can't change it. But if you have a sense of expectancy, then it's a verb. So expectation says that this is what you should do. This is the path for you. This is how life's supposed to turn out for you. And then when you don't meet it, then shame comes in, right? Now, if I have a sense of expectancy that, and I have to believe this, that some good is going to come out of my life. I'm not defining what that good is. I'm just saying that some good is going to come out of my life as long as I show up. So I'm not determining what that should look like, but I'm just showing up and engaging. So that gives me a freedom from the expectation, thus giving me a freedom from falling into that trap of shame as well.
So the reason I asked that is also to then ask this: do you feel that you've given others the opportunity to test what their sense of expectation is? Do you think that you might have scenarios where some of your own expectations of other people might end up being wrong?
I will totally agree to that. I will say that may be one of my major conflicts with quite a few of my relationships. I would say that, have I afforded them the opportunity to see what they would do with that information? Again, you have to understand that I'm coming from a place where my entire life has been built around trying to find safety, where I can feel safe. Sometimes I wonder if the onus is on me to take the risk of finding out if a person is a safe space or has the capacity to hold a space without judging me or without doing anything that will cause harm to me. I don't know if that is my job. It might be my job in certain relationships, or I might have a role to play in certain relationships, but you have to understand that at the end, I'm the one who's going to be bearing that risk. And sometimes it is a matter of life and death, depending on the person or the community. So, yeah, there are times I wonder if with certain friendships, especially the ones from Nigeria, the ones I would have considered really close relationships, there's few where I've sat down with childhood friends from Nigeria and we've had conversations. I can feel safer with them because I know the environment which they have spent so many years in, as opposed to somebody who has spent the vast majority of their lives so immersed in the cultures and traditions that fostered that shame. Of course, it's going to be harder for me to take that risk with them.
In an ideal world where you didn't have to take all the risks, what would that look like for your friends and people who have known you growing up back in Nigeria and people you know in the US? Where is the level of commitment or support that they could potentially offer?
All right, so the first thing I look out for, and I think this would be a challenge to the people that you're speaking about, the first thing I look out for is, in quotes, I'm going to say certainty. Now, what I mean by that is, I got to a point where I was like, you know what? I'm not looking for you to say, I fully accept you, it's great to hear, but realistically, I can't expect that from a whole bunch of people who have grown up in a certain tradition, in a certain culture, that have certain religious or very strong beliefs. But the boundary that I will set for myself, at which I know that if I cross this, it's going to be harmful to me, is the one of certainty. So what I mean by that is that if I find somebody who's saying that they are certain about their beliefs, that this is the way you are supposed to be, there's no room for ambiguity there, I have to draw a boundary and be like, yeah, this relationship is not going to go anywhere because of the certainty that you carry. And my reasoning for this is that, especially, I'm going to speak directly to the religious or theological point of view, is that for you to be certain, for you to be 100% certain about, especially another person's life or another person's lived experience, you have to have 100% knowledge about that person's history, that person's present experience, and that person's future. And nobody has that. You have to be saying that you are God to have that level of certainty. And that's just something I can't deal with. The middle ground for me, per se, would be I can engage with a person who is like, I don't understand, but I'm willing to engage. because that's where I am with the person as well. I'm like, I don't understand how you cannot see that these things that you're saying or these beliefs that you're saying are harmful to other people. But I'm willing to engage with you. But that's what certainty does. It makes you just static there. It closes you off to learning. And that's been one of my biggest struggles with the mainstream Christianity. It's predicated on certainty, and it's confusing because we say faith, we say trust, and then we throw in certainty. It just doesn't make sense. You can't have faith without doubt. It's just not possible.
You can't have faith without doubt. That's very profound. How trusting are you of your own faith? And I'm not talking mainstream, I'm not talking the institution of religion. I'm talking about your own walk based on the reality of who you are, who you've known yourself to be. How has that formed your worldview of your faith?
I do identify as a Christian, right? I guess there's so many inflections as to what Christianity is, and it's a very personal relationship. Here in the States, I spent years committed to a church, and it took me getting into a position of leadership in that particular church to almost shake me as to what was going on. And I feel like I believe that God had to get me to that point to be like, oh, you need to challenge these things. So as you were asking about where I am with my faith, I do have a relationship with God. It's completely different from what I was raised in. Maybe completely different is the wrong way of putting it. Let's just say that there are things that I learned there that are elemental to who I am, but I also things that I found that were just egregiously wrong, that were just done wrong. And I think that's the idea of evolving and growing, is that we challenge these ideas of tradition. You take the good traditions and you do away with the bad ones. And by the bad ones, the ones that are harmful, not indicative of love or kindness or care or acceptance or creating a space without judgment. And those are the things I used to test whatever my faith beliefs are. Are they expanding to include, or are they restricting and excluding?
Do you feel like you're now in a place where you can actually articulate what is inclusive and expanding?
Okay, yeah, I feel I've learned that the idea of curiosity, I found that curiosity, or I've learned that curiosity is a function of love. Love in itself is expanding. It's always expanding to include. And then it's important to ask myself, what does that mean practically for me? And what are the practical steps to doing that? Let's think about the people that you love. Let's take some core relationships, let's say between spouses or partners or a parent and a child. You are curious about that person's life. It's part of loving the person. You're interested in their well-being. You're interested in what they're doing. You're interested in learning about who they are or who they're becoming. The more I'm curious about finding out about more people to open myself to them and them open up to me, it lends a hand more to expanding. And I feel like that's what life should be about. It's about expanding to include. You're learning. If we're not learning, are we actually living?
And do you feel like you are expanding?
Because of my experiences, I feel I have no other choice but to do that. I've seen what it is to be excluded. I know what it is to feel like you're always looking in from the outside. So that's the only option for me. Do I always get it right? Probably not, but at least I feel I can be in that position where I'm like, there's nothing that is stopping me from pursuing that idea of expansion.
Can you remember any specific scenarios, whether it's here or back in Nigeria, where you've come off with that feeling of shame?
In Nigeria and with most African cultures, it's apparent, it's not even questionable where they're like, if you are queer, if you're gay, you're automatically excluded. You're excluded from not just society. You can't show up as your real self in society or culturally, but you are excluded from some of the very important things in life. Now, if I walked up to your stereotypical straight heterosexual person and asked them what are the most important things in their lives, they will probably tell you, especially if they're married with kids, or they'll tell you their children, their relationship with a spouse. They'll tell you those are the most important things in their lives, right? And to say that their sexuality did not play a part in them accessing those things would be naive. It's almost as if a person's sexuality is one of the gateways to experiencing some of those very important things in life. So when you have a cultural system or a belief system that tells people that their sexuality is wrong, you exclude them from experiencing those very good things that you have experienced in your life, partly due to your own sexuality. So you're telling them that they can't experience those good things in their lives because their sexuality is not being expressed as yours. And because you are the dominant culture, you have powerful ways of instituting this exclusion to the point of fear, tons of fear and tons of shame. Is that a practical example of showing you how exclusion, and that has lifelong detrimental effects?
Of course. And in the US, this is not the same scenario, though.
So in the US, it's not the same. When I moved to the US, you know that gay marriage wasn't even legal at that time. Gay marriage wasn't legal until I want to say 2010 or something around there. But I've seen it change. But it's still not perfect. Like I said, I went to a church where, they would say that, okay, you can be queer, you can attend, but obviously your relationship or your sexuality is not celebrated in the same way. You can't get married there if you wanted to. You can't hold positions of leadership. So you're already being excluded because of who you are. Those are practical. That happens here, and it's still happening right now as we speak.
You mentioned something now, and you stressed that in the way you expressed it. You said, because of who you are. Do you think you can describe that to an average person so that it leaves the realm of right, wrong, and just go to the core of it? Can you explain that?
So this has always been the argument. Is your sexual identity actually who you are, or is it something you do? And there are these couple of years when I was so into this argument where I was like, if it's this sword I'm going to die on, I'm going to have this argument with people who think that they can tell me who I am. The older I've gotten, I'm like, I cannot convince you of who I am. What I say is that if you're saying my sexuality is a choice, I have to ask you, when did you make that choice? What choices were available to you when you made that choice? And what process did you go through to get to the choice that you made? But I'm done with the whole arguing or trying to convince a person about who I am or what my identity is. This is my lived experience. The proof is that I used to think like that as well. I went through the years of trying to change, trying to fix, and it just didn't happen. I did everything that was told to me by the people who said that this is, whether they called it an identity crisis or a disease or an addiction, I did everything and nothing worked. So rather than it even working, was that it left me with tons of things that I regret, tons of things that I feel like I now have to go back and undo.
Do you still see it through the eyes of an institution? Do you still see it through the eyes of other people, or has that become something totally different for you?
For where I am right now, I cannot see it through the lens of an institution. In fact, I find the institution definitely not to be a safe space. I find it to be doing more harm than good. And this is not to say my time in the church was, I know we haven't talked about that experience, but there was a sense of community I got from there that I'm not going to lie, I do miss it a lot. I wish I could still have that. But I also have to ask, how authentic was that community if I couldn't really show up as who I am? If I told people that this is who I am, would it still be the community that I think or that I experienced? I left the church maybe 8 years ago or so. And over those years, there are times that I've tried to go back. I've tried to re-engage with a different church, and I'm just not in that space. I feel like there's a lack of accountability, and I'm talking from the US perspective here, or the churches that I've been to. So maybe I need to go to a church that is accepting, and there are tons of them in the US. It's just that I'm not at the point where the whole institutionalized religion works for me right now.
So how are you finding that expression? Are you making any substitutions for it at this time? Is there any other thing that is sitting in the space of faith for you?
So my faith is there. I'm not saying that I do not have, like in Christian terminology, we would say we have a relationship with Jesus or we have a relationship with God. And I still have that. I still pray. I still have a strong idea of his presence in my life, but the way I experience it is completely different. For instance, when I go to work, when I'm working on a cake, I feel like I'm engaging with creativity. I feel like I'm engaging with something that's bigger than me. I feel I'm engaging with an aspect of God. I think that when we go out and when we engage with people, we're engaging with creativity. We're taught that human beings are created in the likeness of God. You're engaging with a representative of God here in the world. So when I go out and engage, I feel like I'm doing that. So just the traditional expression of faith, as in how I was raised, has completely changed. I still have faith, but it's just not the same way that was.
There's always been faith tied to community. And you had mentioned something about solitude and how that is a good thing, but not isolation. Now, I take that to mean that when you're working, you have that benefit of solitude. Does that ever get to the point where it starts to feel like isolation?
The best way I'm going to say, I can express this, is that there are two things we'll look at, right? When I'm working, like in that space of where I'm creating or working on my cakes, now this may be a good thing or it may be a bad thing. Right from a young age, I have learned that that space is my safest space. So it will be very hard for me to let anyone in there. And from what I've learned from other gay men is that we learn to protect ourselves from a very young age. We form these walls of just keeping ourselves. And for me, you can see the cake thing was part of it. So it's really hard for me to allow anybody into that baking space, like to come and work with me. It's going to be tremendously hard, not because I don't want the person to, it's just that I feel like you are going to take away a safety that I've known for so long. You're going to infiltrate it in a way that I don't know that I can handle. It's almost like I need to be able to go, I need to have this protective space for myself. And I think that's why it's really comfortable for me to work alone. At the core of it is the safety and belonging I found there that I almost don't want to be challenged. Mm-hmm. And you can say that's a form of solitude in a good way. But then there is a danger of loneliness. And when I say loneliness, it's aside from my whole baking experience. I think this is a challenge that I want to say most gay men my age, I even think those that were raised in the US experience this as well. So I can't imagine what it is for other people who are living in parts of the world where they're completely criminalized, is that because we've learned to protect ourselves so much, it's hard to let other people in. We haven't developed the tools of allowing people in, of being seen. We've just learned that I need to present a certain way. We've just learned to curate our lives. And it was necessary to do that because you had to protect yourself. So there is the risk of loneliness being a thing because you just don't know how to let people in. I think we're all dealing with the same thing because there's a pressure to show that the same pressures that I feel straight people feel like you need to show up as if I've got everything together and I'm fully accepting of who I am. But it takes a while for you to get to that point. It takes a lot of work and it probably is a lifelong struggle.
Do you think people who are not in that community don't just know how much they take for granted? That there's a certain naivety about it when that sense of who you are is aligned to what is the majority of people.
Yeah, I do. And I'm not trying to say one person's life is harder than another person's, but I do have to say that there is this sense or idea of privilege. And that's one thing we have to consider. We all have privileges. It's something that we get that we didn't work for. And probably somebody else doesn't have that, you know. I guess what I'm trying to get at is I think straight people have straight privilege. And with that privilege comes blind spots, things that you take for granted. The most common one is that we'll say, okay, a straight person never has to come out. If you ask a gay person of a certain age, they will tell you that one of the hardest things they've ever done in their lives was to come out. And it's something that they repeatedly have to do over and over again. It almost never stops. And a straight person never has to go through that experience. They just don't know what it is to have that ridiculously hard, vulnerable conversation that has cost people their entire sense of belonging or family. So there's one thing, I think that's one of the very first glaring, and it's not something we can ignore. The idea that a straight person might be like, they have a path set before them, that they take it for granted that I meet somebody, we get married, our relationship is going to be celebrated. It's just a path that's set before you. And for a queer person or a gay person, that's not there. You may not even have any examples whatsoever in your life. I mean, in my case, there were no examples. Not only were there no examples, there was no language. And I keep saying language because if you can't articulate something, it's almost as if the thing doesn't exist. Again, that's just one of the privileges. So I guess the question is, what do you do with your privilege?
I just want to pick up on that stuff that you said is what you do with your privileges. Aren't there parallels in the gospel message itself that applies to where your identity is at the moment, other than what is just an institutional sense of right and wrong?
Oh, so you mean like, let me just try and clarify, like examples where, let's say a common one is that the Bible says that you should not judge, or like he who is without sin cast the first stone. An argument could be made for that. To the latter example that I gave, as in he who is without sin should cast the first stone. I don't think that's a good example for my experience because it's equating who I am as being sinful. So I wouldn't say that's a good example for me. Now, it's a very good and interesting question. And when you were talking about excluding where people wouldn't talk to a leper, what came to mind was, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, was the AIDS epidemic in the US. Now, I didn't know that story until I started looking into it. Yes, we knew that it was an AIDS epidemic, but we didn't know how bad it was. And this happened in the 80s. This wasn't that long ago. You hear the stories of the gay men that survived the epidemic, was that Christian people who belonged to churches, and they had gay kids who had AIDS, wouldn't even come to visit their children. Is it worth engaging with an institution that is so adamant, at least at this point in history? With this, I don't want to sound defeatist, and I applaud everybody, the people who are out there fighting that narrative or fighting that. I think they are doing God's work.
The experience that you had with this church community that you said was great until your ascent into a leadership position, was that something you wanted to expand
on? Sure, to the best I can. It was a good part. When I moved to Houston, the church was one of the first things I looked out for, and I was lucky to come across this church. It's one of the older churches here in the U.S. I found a great community there, and we were sort of same age bracket, same life stage, and we were just pretty much doing life together. This is your 20s and 30s. You're able to do tons of stuff together. And so that was great. It was a wonderful sense of community. I made some really good lifelong friends who were very supportive of me. Coming here as an immigrant, it's a struggle. So just having that community was great. And that sense of friendship. I believe that this was pretty much my chosen family here in the U.S. And yeah, I got into the leadership. I just happened to get on that at a time where the denomination was also wrestling with the idea of remaining in a denomination that was going to be affirming of the queer community and one that was saying no, they were going to adhere to. So not to get into all the politics and all the drama, I happened to be there in a position of leadership when that was happening. And of course, the leaders are pretty much charged with how this decision goes. And I have to say that personally, I was also going through my own struggles because this was at my tail end of going through all the conversion therapy iterations that were available to me, and nothing was working. And just to see the way that was handled there, in my opinion, it was extremely exclusive and did not want to hear anything that was not in accordance with their conservative view. And I found that to be, there was just something wrong about that because you were not paying attention to voices that were not supporting your position. They would only bring people who affirmed what they were saying. And I just thought that was wrong. It seemed so out of character for anything that you would say was loving. Rather, it felt very exclusive, very certain. And I have to say that my fear of certainty really started at that point, because to see the way people held on to their beliefs was alarming, because I was like, this person will go to any lengths to maintain this. That just disturbed me so much that I was supposed to be on, I think it was a 3-year term. And after the first 2 years, I just couldn't do it. I sent in a resignation. I left the church completely. And there is a sadness to it because I had formed a lot of relationships there. There's also sadness because I never got to have conversations with certain people about what got me to where I was. Like I said, I've tried to re-engage in the past, but I've just not been in that spot yet.
I just want to bring it all back to where you are at this stage. You have your work, which is doubling for your space of safety at the moment. Do you have community around you where you don't have to struggle with the negatives like shame and exclusion? Do you have a safe space that's a community for you at the moment?
That's something I'm working on. It's the older you get, the view that it's harder to make friends, especially when people are in different stages of life. Most people my age right now will probably be dealing with kids and they're having to get them to all the activities and stuff like that. So their lives are completely different. And of course, they would be engaging more with people who have similar challenges. So community is something I would say I desire. I do have some friends that we'll meet for lunch or dinner, maybe once every couple of weeks. I guess in summary, I would say I would like to have a stronger community, a place that feels very safe, or in a place where I can be seen without any fear. So yeah, I would love to say that, I have that community right now, but that won't be really true.
So are you exploring that in the context of people who've just known you more, that you would consider, this is someone who's known me like way back from my childhood days? Do you reckon those would be the ones that would be more impactful for you?
I think it would be nice to have a combination of both, because I think about my friends from childhood. Yes, it would be great to reconnect with them on that level. Realistically, I have to be for my friends from childhood from Nigeria, but also I've been in the States for over 20 years. So yeah, for my friends from different stages as well, that I would like to have that. It would be great to connect on that communal level. Realistically, I don't know how that would work. And then personally, I would be lying to say that there's always the fear. I appreciate it when people say that, okay, they see me as the same person. And to a certain extent, that's true. But I've also changed. There are things about, just like they would have changed as well. There are things that have come into their lives that made them different people. And the question is, do they have the capacity? Are they able to hold a space to hold who I am today? And same for me, am I able to hold a space to hold a space for who they are today? Those are just practical things that have to be addressed. So there's a lot of work that goes into building a community, at least an authentic one.
Putting aside what they can hold, what can you hold? What do you feel like you have the capacity to hold for other people in building community?
I think I can hold a lot. Just kidding. But honestly, I like to think that what's going to make me able or give me the ability to hold that space or create that space is the idea of curiosity, to be able to have real conversations, to be able to open up. But at the same time, I know that's also a disadvantage for me because it's not easy for me to open up. It's terrifying as well. So that's why I'm saying there is a lot of work, especially if I'm trying to build a community right now. There is a lot of hard and intentional work that has to go into it. I am willing to do that. I can't say that I'm perfect, but I also have to find people that are willing to do that. I also have to accept their imperfections.
Do you take into account the fact that there might be people who actually have other expressions of shame that are not of the sort that you deal with? That may be, for those people, as restrictive about reaching out as it is for you?
Yes, yeah, I do. I feel like almost every individual has got to have some kind of shame, just given the human experience. I start with the premise that everybody has a story, that what I'm seeing, what I'm thinking, because there are times I might be like, oh my God, my life would have been so much easier if I didn't have to deal with this. There's so many examples of other iterations in which shame could appear in different people's lives. Just off the top of my head, I could think about people who have been abused, people who have been abandoned. Just even in our older ages, I think about my friends who have probably gone through a divorce or something like that. It could make them feel, depending on the community they are in, there could be a lot of residual shame that comes from that, especially if they feel like they failed at something so important. And I think that's where curiosity comes in, because curiosity means that I have to intentionally and actively listen to a person's story, to pay attention to their lived experiences. Yes, I might be able to use some of my own experiences to empathize, or as a jumping board for me to empathize with another person. But I've also learned that there's a danger with empathy. It's a great thing to have, but when we think we're this very empathetic person, then we stop listening. We stop being curious because we think that we've gotten to the point where I understand what this person is feeling based on either our own feelings or based on the limited amount of information we've learned or garnered from that person. So there is a danger in empathy that we can think that we've gotten to that point and then we stop listening, or we think we have all the information. And that's one thing I try to tell myself constantly. It's something that I have to continue reminding myself that empathy is not the goal. The goal is to stay present and to continue listening. Yes, you continuously show empathy, but you also want to be in a spot where I'm constantly listening, because for the person who's going through whatever struggles they're going, it's like an onion. They're going to be peeling layers, more layers and more layers. And I would hope that they would do the same for me as well, and not just base the empathy or compassion that I would be feeling from them would not be based on their own experiences alone, but a combination of their experiences, but also by listening to my story. And I want to be able to do the same for them as well.
So then you do see yourself in that place of leadership, of being able to articulate a story for both people who are your peers, people who are generations removed from you.
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel like that's what it is to be human.
Hey, Edet, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Some stories stay with us, not because they ended, but because they never really did. This is Echoes and Parables.